one thing that's jumped out at me since I joined X, because I wasn't on Twitter for very long when it was previous to Elon buying it out with his group of investors. But after I got on there, one thing that I found was apparently Freemasons run the world. And now this is an old idea. And I wanted to take some time to talk about that because I am one, have been for about 20 something years, belong to the Grand Lodge of Tennessee. And boy, I wish that I was involved in running the world. I like, either they're just leaving me out of all the cool stuff, and it's some Freemasons way up that I've never met that are getting to do all the cool stuff, but I haven't been involved in it. I haven't seen it. And then I quickly learned to not engage with the people that were saying that Freemasons run the world. And of course, it's never just the Freemasons. It's always Zog and Freemasons and Illuminati and this group and that group. So you just kind of buckshot at who's running the world. And then if one of them happens to actually exist and to be doing stuff, well, then you were right all along. I guess that's their perspective, but I learned not to engage because there was nothing I could tell them that they would believe. Because when I would give counter evidence to it, they would say, well, of course you'll say that. You're a Mason. Oh, yeah.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of suppression. Yeah.
Yeah, how do you talk your way out of that? And I don't think that they're interested to hear any evidence. So they won't believe anything I say contrary to what they say, and they won't accept anything as possibly disproving what they're talking about. Now, it's a fun idea. I like some of the mythology around it as fun, just mental play, but it usually relies on this historical connection that shows that the Freemasons are, in fact, descendants of the Knights Templar, and we found something underneath the Temple Mount almost 1,000 years ago, and now we have mind control raised. Maybe the original Templars became the Darrow. Do you ever think
That's what
about
they found
that?
under the temple in Jerusalem was the Hollow Earth,
Okay.
where the Darrow are.
So I want to talk about that just for a few minutes. The pedigree of Freemasons coming from the Knights Templar. It sounds fun, but spoiler alert, I haven't seen anything that makes me think 100% there's a smoking gun. That's the thing. That's the tie. It all proves it. For a very brief history of the Knights Templar, they weren't the first crusading order to pop up after the Crusades, but they were peculiar. They had interesting sponsors. It's a very fascinating story to find out what that was about. And I would recommend Dungeon, Fire, and Sword, which unfortunately I don't have a copy of anymore, but it's a cottage industry of tying the Freemasons to the Templars. Like, this is a pretty good book, or at least it's readable, but then you get all kinds of strange ones that really get into pharaonic Egypt and allegedly Satanism, saying that we really worship Lucifer and this and that. And it's all very exciting, but I've never seen any evidence of that. Now, again, anybody in the audience could say that, of course you'll say that. Well, let me preface this with, before I'm a Mason, I'm a Christian, and of the Abrahamic faiths, mine's the only one that doesn't endorse lying. So my conception of God would be mad at me for lying to you about this. And it seems like in the Western imperial era, when we were going out colonizing, conquering the world, and we're encountering all these strange cultures, you had a bunch of people in London and in Paris who were very excited about, how do I get involved in this romance and this mystery? And they came up with a bunch of secret societies and new mystery cults that didn't actually have anything to do with an authentic predecessor group. It was a bunch of guys that got together and came up with party games, basically. But that said, Freemasons have had political impact on the world, because the American Revolution probably wouldn't have looked like what it was had so many of the founders not been Freemasons. And that was a very conservative revolution as opposed to liberal revolution, in that they wanted to hold on to the rights of Englishmen. They didn't want new rights. They just wanted the rights they thought they would already have.
And interestingly, it's not just that the founders were Masons. The British Army was led by Masons too. The officers in the British Army, there were lodges all over the regiments. And one theory I read was that one of the reasons that the British did so poorly is because the British officers who believed in the ideas of liberty and brotherhood and so forth, because of the Masonic ties, they wanted colonials to win. It wasn't a conspiracy where like they all got together and planned it all out, but it was just sort of, they were very sympathetic to the ideals of the colonials because of their Masonic ties, and they might have gone a little easy on them in terms of the conduct of the war.
I can consider that.
Because you saw that on both sides. Each units would have their own lodges, and you saw this throughout the British Army in the colonial period. In India, all of the different regiments and so forth, they all had their own lodges attached with them. So it was a very widespread thing in the Victorian era. Yeah.
Interesting. And then in more recent times, both Romania and Portugal had significant power struggles that involved Freemasons as being one of the principal groups, because towards the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire under the Habsburgs, Romania had a bunch of Freemasons running around it, and they liked the idea of liberty. Well, it's hard to have liberty when you're in an empire. And so they created a bunch of trouble for the Habsburg monarchs. And then when the fascists took over, well, they didn't like somebody else having a little piece of their own pie that the state wasn't involved in. So they went after him. The Soviets went after him. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, Freemasonry's undergone something of a renaissance in Romania. They're very active. And Portugal, you had a dictator in the mid 20th century, kind of like you did with Franco in Spain. And it was the Portuguese dictator who was friends with the Catholic Church, and they were being opposed by Freemasons. So that's the most recent example I can think of. And the most recent US president that was a Freemason was Gerald Ford. Wasn't elected, wasn't in for long, and the Bushes were skull and bones. So I can't speak to them at all. But what I see when I look around is Masonic lodges, they don't do a whole lot, at least in the US these days. They're dwindling in numbers because you got the boomers
I've heard, yeah.
dying off, and it's mostly a supper club where we go behind closed doors and talk about paying the water bill. So for all those who think we're in charge,
the Masons do a lot of charity work. You know, you have the Shriners hospitals. They raise money for all kinds of different charities and so forth. I say this as an outsider. I'm not a Mason. My grandfather was, though. He was a 32nd degree Scottish Rite. You do see a lot of this in the form of charitable works and so forth, good works. At least some good comes out.
The world. As an outsider, what's your perspective? Do you see something different?
Well, not in terms of Masons running the world or anything like that. I don't think so. I mean, certain groups do better because they have ways of making connections to each other. And, you know, these get expressed in business and politics and so forth. The same thing with country clubs or anything where you have an opportunity to socialize with people you might not necessarily have access to otherwise. Right. You know, and that'll naturally lead to business deals maybe, or politics will happen. But in terms of an organized conspiracy to rule the world, that's nonsense. There are other candidates.
If there is one from a Masonic lodge, I will be as surprised as the rest of you. That's what I'll say.
But in terms of the origins of Freemasonry, which you were talking about, again, from the outsider's point of view, from what I know, they do make claims of being associated with the builders of Solomon's Temple and so forth, which does seem to be a bit of a stretch from a unbroken historical chain kind of point of view.
Yeah.
But, and again, this is I'm only speaking as an outsider, and my knowledge is imperfect because of that. But from what I understand, Masonic ritual and the offices that hold to perform the rituals looks a lot like Mithraic ritual, the Mithraic cultus. You know, the Mithraic mysteries that were prevalent in the Roman Empire. They were a big rival to Christianity in the early days. You know, emperors were brought into the Mithraic mysteries and so forth. They had discovered Mithraiums where the bull would be sacrificed across the empire, especially on the borders, because it was big with the legions and so forth. But in terms of the specifics of ritual, and we know the specifics of the rituals that the Mithraists did because they recorded and written down, and we have the temples and all the symbolism and so forth. A lot of it seems to be very, very similar to what you see in modern Freemasonry. Again, I don't think an unbroken lineage makes a lot of sense because there's a lot of time not accounted for between the last reported Mithras worshippers and the first reported Freemasons. Yeah. There's a lot of time that you have to explain what was going on. And, you know, there are some potential explanations that deal with Islam, and there's a Sufi tradition of Freemasonry too, which a lot of people don't know about. And there are possible channels. I'm counting that. But I wonder if it would be at all possible for the modern people, as you say, who got together and created these social organizations. I wonder how much of their thought was influenced by what they knew about Mithraism. How influenced were they by their classical educations? Because depending on how far back you go, they had access to the same information that we do today about Mithraism. I wonder if some of that didn't creep in as a deliberate action. It would be fun if it was a living, unbroken lineage going back to the 4th century Rome, but you're going to have to fill up 1,000+ years.
Yeah.
How did that transmission happen during that time?
And I have seen it alleged that the Templar connection comes from after Philip the Fair put down the Templars because he owed them so much money he'd never be able to pay it back.
And during the French Revolution, remember, somebody in the crowd, when they beheaded the king, somebody in the crowd shouted out, "Jacques de Molay, you are revenged," because he was the last Grand Master of the Templars.
Maybe.
So
And then when the
it all
persecution started in France, well, Portugal and many of the princelets in Germany, they said, well, we're not going to persecute these folks, but tell you what, now you're part of our national knightly order. So it's possible that some folks from there,
and Scotland.
Scotland
There's
as
a
well. Yeah.
big Templar presence in Scotland. You see all those chapels everywhere with the Templar crosses and so forth. So a lot of them escaped from France into Scotland too. And they keep talking about what happened to all the money. They were big bankers because they had priories in the Holy Land and across Europe. Essentially, they invented modern banking, where you could deposit money in one place, you'd get a receipt, and then you would take that receipt somewhere else, and they would give you the money. They started that largely. They were immensely wealthy, which is, as you said, that's why the French king wanted to dissolve them, because he wanted he wanted their gold and never found it.
So it's possible. I haven't been convinced yet, though.
That's what
But
that
by
Money
all
Pit
means,
Island is, New England, right? That's the Templar treasure in that.
what are they on? Season 15 and they still haven't
Yes.
found crap? Yeah.
Oh, I
Oh my
remember reading
God.
about that in the 80s before
I
there
can't
was a
believe it.
Discovery Channel.
I'm pretty sure we've proven that nothing happened there, because how motivated could someone be to have dug it so far that these people haven't found it after, what, 15 years of concerted digging? I don't know, man. But Freemasonry is very interesting. I'm not taking anything away from the kind words that Joe had for it. It's just, as far as us ruling the world, I'm getting left out and I'm kind of miffed about that. So, but